My 33rd year actually of covering these files, longer than I've actually been on the earth, I think. But I started way back in 1921, so I don't look too bad considering. And in those days, files were closed for 150 to 200 years, and they tended to have kind of imaginative titles like Their Majesty's Portraits, 1950, closed for 200 years, or Redistribution of Seats, Londonderry, 1935, closed for 200 years. And we had to guess, one of the biggest stories was some files closed, and we had to guess, was that file probably, likely, almost certainly about gerrymandering, or had the portraits somehow miscarried on the way across the channel to the house on the hill. But the files this year, I suppose Sam and I were talking about this as we covered them in those pre-Christmas days, and there was no overwhelmingly big story. Last year it was the UDR, which you could see was very much in meltdown, about to be transformed, indeed to be transmuted into the Royal Irish Regiment, and that happens actually in 1992. The UDRs merged with the RIR in a new regiment, and Tom King signs it off as Minister of Defence, but someone who was here during the kind of stormy days of the Anglo-Irish Agreement and afterwards. But we have a number of almost contemporary themes this year, including the Irish language, for example, and indeed relations between the parties, slightly different parties then, the UUP and SDLP, in prime position, of course, in the early 1990s. Not all the files date from 1992. We have, in fact, some files from the late 80s, which are interesting in themselves, and I'm sure Sam and I will be referring to those as well. But just to get us back to those tempestuous days, 2 or 3 years, you know, the darkest hour before the dawn, before the ceasefires. 1992 began this time of year with an upsurge of IRA and loyalist violence. You remember perhaps that on the 17th of January 1992, 7 Protestant building workers were killed by an IRA bomb at T-Ban in County Tyrone. And on the same night, the Secretary of State, Peter Brook, who'd been doing a very good job and would do a very good job at trying to instigate meaningful political dialogue, blundered on the Late Late Show by singing My Darling Clementine, and was gone within 3 months, replaced by Sir Patrick Mayhew, the former Attorney General. But the talks go on, of course. The following month, February, saw the Sean Graham atrocity by loyalists on the Ormer Road. The same year saw a focus on collusion by the police, by the political parties, a number of murders allegedly linked to that. The Westminster election, which saw John Major returned, and indeed the big parties. The UUP had 35.5% of the vote in that election. The SDLP, led by John Hume, the UUP, led by James Molyneux, the SDLP, led by John Hume, had 23.5% of the vote, and indeed the DUP were at 13%, led by Dr. Paisley, and Sinn Féin, led by Gerry Adams, on 10%. And of course the big story of that election was Joe Hendren's victory in West Belfast, ousting Gerry Adams after almost a decade. So that's the kind of year that was in it. 85 people were killed violently that year, and there were several hundred explosions and shooting incidents and so on. So that's what the almost 500 files fully open from PRONI, thanks to David and his team, focus on that particular year. But in some ways, you know, there are portents of problems today. This is the period of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which had set up the Anglo-Irish Conferences held 3 or 4 times a year in Dublin, in London, sometimes in Belfast, and indeed the Joint Secretariat operating at Maryfield, with Irish civil servants from Foreign Affairs seconded to the bunker, really, in the shadow of Palace Barracks with their British counterparts. A lot of drafting and redrafting and dealing with issues on the ground, shooting incidents, behaviour of troops, intimidation, cultural issues, all of that being discussed day on day at Maryfield, and it finds expression, of course, in these files. The importance of the Irish language as a cultural and identity issue in the wake of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, again, looms large here. Among the files released, it's a very interesting report, which I don't think ever saw the light of day outside the upper echelons of the civil service. A report compiled by a public servant, Kevin Sweeney, of the Policy Planning and Research Unit at Stormont, on the Irish language in Northern Ireland in 1987. And in many ways, it produces the results of a recent study of 5,000 people in the region on their interest in and ability to use Irish and so on. There's an historical background. It recalls that in 1911, 13% of the population of the as yet undivided island used Irish, and many of those were native Irish speakers. That had fallen from perhaps over half in 1845 on the eve of Ungotamore, the great famine which had wiped out 1 million Irish speakers and sent another million, many of them Irish speakers, to America. It noted that when Northern Ireland was established, 1.7% of the population of the 6 counties were Irish speaking. But in 1921 there were 3 Gaeltacht districts in Northern Ireland. The Glens of Antrim, Red Bay, Rathlin Island, where both traditions spoke Gaelic, influenced by Scots Gaelic, and of course the Sperrins in Tyrone, South Derry. And that reminded me of my student jobs in the agricultural department of the civil service, when you would be looking up files for County Tyrone, and when the inspector went out to a farm, he would sometimes do a column, any other comments, and he would very often write from Glen Hull in County Tyrone or Glen Arif in County Antrim, Irish speakers. So this was in the 1950s, so that was the residue of that. Interestingly, looking at 1987, the report revealed that something like 25,000 people at post-primary level were studying Irish, and almost 2,000 of those took Irish in public examinations in Northern Ireland. The highest interest was in West Belfast, where for most people the reason cited for their interest was called national identity, something that the Irish government were pushing at the Secretariat during these years. And interest was higher amongst young people, under 25 it said, and so on. By that stage you had an Irish language radio station, which the civil service had just discovered, and they knew there was a newspaper in West Belfast, but they didn't know there was a radio station called Radio Falch, it's still going today. We see deputations to Stormont by the SDLP in particular, with their fluent Irish speakers led by Breed Rogers and Sean Farren, pushing for the depoliticising of Irish and a move towards a Welsh Language Act. The Welsh Act had been brought in 1987, something like, I think 40% of people in North Wales are Welsh speaking, and it had been preserved there historically, and they wanted to move to a Welsh style Language Act, which echoes the disputes of the past year, of course, at a political level here. They said this would reduce the exploitation of the language and so on. The British government responded by setting up, for example, the Ultag Trust, a charity to promote the Irish language for all. The question on the 1991 census, of course, reflected that sort of acknowledgement of an Irish strand, an Irish linguistic strand. The whole thing reaches a climax in 1992, and this is completely new, because there was a court case about 2012-13, I remember, because I was asked to give a kind of expert historical advice in the case, where a private individual sought the right to use Irish in the courts of Northern Ireland. The obstacle, as these files make clear, was the 1737 Act of the Old Irish Parliament, which was known as the Language sort of Law Courts Act of 1737, passed in the days of even Grattan's Parliament, before Grattan's Parliament, the Old Irish Parliament in Dublin, which laid down that English must be used exclusively in courts of law. And the Irish government had been pressing for the removal of the 1949 Act, which banned Irish being used in place names. It was pressing for the use, a facility to use Irish in correspondence with government departments, which was eventually introduced, a translation service. And then finally the Irish submitted in 1992 that it is the view of the Irish government that the Irish language should be given parity of esteem with English, and that legislation should be introduced similar to the Welsh Act of 1967. And this would reduce mischief, they said, by politically motivated elements. Behind the scenes, Sir Patrick Mayhew, oddly enough, was involved in an attempt to legalise the use of Irish for those who wanted to introduce it in Northern Ireland courts, and that comes across here. In October 1992, Mayhew wrote to Lord Mackay of I hope I've got that right. There's Mackays and Mackays, and they spell their name the same way. I think the Scottish are Mackays. But Lord Mackay of Clashfern, who was the Lord Chancellor, and pressed him to amend the 1737 Language Act, and which enacted that only English could be used in the courts of law here. Mackay replied. He agreed in principle to the removal of all barriers to use Irish, but he would treat it as a non-indigenous language, and he did not agree to removing the 1737 Act. That caused a problem. He seemed to think that this Act didn't ban the use of Irish. In fact, it had done on the whole island until 1922, and in the north since 1922. So, in the end, Mayhew's advisors warned him to write back to the Lord Chancellor and say that the Lord Chancellor's line on Irish was not in sync with the liberalising policy of the NIO. So he writes back making this point. We don't know what the result was. We can assume that the Lord Chancellor refused to endorse this recommendation to make Irish more available, because we have a paper from Tony McCusker, a senior Stormont official, at the end of 1992, writing to the J. Bailey of the Northern Ireland Court Service, saying that a negative approach by the judiciary would undoubtedly be seen as political. And of course, it emerged in the courts 5 years ago, and Mr. Justice Seamus Tracy ruled that under the law, under the 1737 Act, still in use, Irish could not be used in the courts of law. So it's very interesting in that respect. And of course, it's the glaring, or one of the glaring issues, so many developing by the weekend, dividing parties here at the moment with loads on people's heads and all kinds of things. Other files produced in this period, of course, one focused on Catholic disadvantage. This is the era of the transformation of the Fair Employment Agency of 1976 to the Equality Commission of 1989-90, and the stiffening of fair employment legislation in Northern Ireland during this period. The background was the McBride Principles campaign in the United States, where a number of legislatures from Washington to California were endorsing the McBride Principles, which the British government argued were discriminatory and were actually likely to dissuade investment in the region. But there's a very interesting file produced at the end of 1989, January 1990, collated by Ronnie Spence on Catholic disadvantage. And he pointed out that Catholics were at that stage more than 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed than Protestants in Northern Ireland. They experienced higher levels of underachievement in education, and they suffered greater levels of poverty and disadvantage. And in his comments, his opening comments, Spence informed ministers, this is including at that stage Peter Brook, he said that Northern Ireland is a deeply divided society. From that division flows the violence and political instability, which of course was right. And he says that even if the violence ended and the settlement was found, quote unquote, the fundamental divisions would remain and threaten progress on both the political and security fronts. Well, maybe we're there today. But in this paper, he talked about hard and soft issues. This public official, and he argued that soft issues were things like mutual understanding in schools. They were easily addressed and worked to a large extent. But the harder issues were trying to create equality of employment and reduce poverty in those areas which suffered most, and that community which suffered most. He said that special initiatives such as making Belfast work from the mid-1980s had made little progress in tackling poverty and disadvantage. And he looked at the socioeconomic profile of the two communities, and he said that among Roman Catholic males, their male unemployment rate was 36% as compared to 14% of Protestants. How would this be dealt with? He talked about a problem in the mismatch of between where Roman Catholics tended to live and where jobs were located. This is a problem going back to the 1970s in these files. At the height of the Troubles, the reluctance of Catholics, say in West or North Belfast, to travel to East Belfast, for example, to work. The attempt to bring work like DeLorean bring factories and initiatives to areas like West Belfast. And Ronnie Spence concluded that, as in the United States, in the United States, despite civil rights legislation in the 60s, the rate of black unemployment remained significantly above the rate of white, and he feared a continuance of that pattern here. Ken Bloomfield, the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, weighed in with his view. He said that any positive discrimination in favour of Catholics would be illegal and would antagonise the Protestant community. The only way was a programme of affirmative action to address inequalities based on a criteria of objective need. And this led to a suggestion that somehow the block grant might be increased, 100 million sought in 1990, but this led to a warning from Pat Carville of the Department of Finance, who warned that any bid to ask the Treasury for £100 million for special affirmative action programmes would be rejected. But even more worryingly, would raise the thorny issue of a Treasury raid on the block grant. No £1 billion on the table there. I'm not sure if it's there now either, but there you are. And then, of course, this was the period of the Brook talks. And at the time, we thought the Convention of 75 had failed, the majority report. The Atkins talks of 1979 had quickly run into the sands. Within unionism, within official unionism, the influence of Enoch Powell meant that the idea of integration was very much a policy, at variance with the devolutionary policies of others in that party. Paisley still demanding majority rule, devolution at Stormont. The SDLP demanding some form of power sharing with an Irish dimension. Sinn Féin really out of it, and cheerleaders for the IRA campaign at the time. But we can now see that the Brook talks were very important in kickstarting the process that would lead to Good Friday 1998. And there's a lot of hints and nods and indeed principles emerging at this period that would inform that whole process. The talks got off to a bad start though in April 1991 when John Hume arrived in with his delegation and complained that they'd been confronted with quote-unquote a loyalist head case in the grounds of Stormont, complete with posters, and this would be the international impression of the beginning of the talks. The British government expressed distress, the Minister distressed at this and said, well, it was the first day and things might improve. But they didn't really, because Paisley arrived in a few days later on the 8th of May, and Peter Robinson, he looked very forlorn, and Peter Robinson explained on his behalf that Dr. Paisley had that morning been locked out of his room and out of his toilet. So things were looking pretty badly. Paisley also complained that in the background, the NAO were briefing against him. He was seen as an obstacle to these constitutional talks, and he said that a journalist in The Economist had been told that Paisley hopefully would die soon from overeating Kentucky Fried Chicken. Again, Peter Brook expressed distress, but as an old stringer himself for the Daily Telegraph in Europe in the 1950s, I remember him telling the story at a dinner I was at, he said he wouldn't believe what journalists told him about his sources and all of that. But if you like, problems emerged almost right away, irreconcilable difficulties between the parties on the question of a venue for strand 2 of these evolving talks. The 3-strand idea had been agreed, which would of course inform the final settlement on Good Friday 1998. The problem was the SDLP wanted the north-south aspect, strand 2, located on the island of Ireland, preferably in Dublin. If that couldn't be achieved, John Hume said Armagh as the ecclesiastical capital would be perfectly acceptable. Paisley said because of Articles 2 and 3, the DUP could not accept that, and the talk should be held in London, where Michael Collins had negotiated the treaty in 1921. The Ulster Unionists were much more flexible. For that party, the Reverend Barton Smith said they had actually considered Rockall, that lonely rock in the North Atlantic, which might have worked better actually. They might have agreed sooner to get off the rock from the evil tides that were engulfing them, or would have, I presume, had they gone. In any event, that was ruled out. Paisley ruled out Armagh. He said there would be prayers in the cathedral, it would be totally disgusting. So there wouldn't be any talks on Armagh. But he took John Hume's point, not directly. And again, Sam and I have discussed this. One of the amazing things about this period is the constant dialogue between Paisley and Hume. At Strasbourg, in Brussels, in the House of Commons, all the time. Paisley is able to say, I spoke to Mr. Hume for 2 hours last night. You have this constant dialogue, and actually Paisley, concerned about John Hume being confronted by protesters on the ground. Paisley said, if this continues, nerves will be jarred before we ever get to the conference table. You have that dialogue. You have Hume telling the deputy head of the NIO in 1991-92 that Paisley will prove much more flexible than the Ulster Unionist leadership at this stage. And there's clearly a rapport there. Although we find Martin Smith and others and Molyneux saying that he found Mr. Hume very civil in his dealings with him, but that's interesting in itself. But how to find a sort of via media in terms of a location for these talks? It became a major issue. The Irish government, of course, weighed in with Jerry Collins, the Irish Minister of Home Affairs, saying that he was prepared to either go to Ballymena, Coal Island or Adair, where Paisley, the minute say missing the point, says he knows nothing about Coal Island. So anyway, at the end of the day, talks were eventually arranged in Dublin in September 1992. The DUP opted out, but James Molyneux led a unionist deputation, and I remember at the time reading this, was overawed by the British nature of Dublin Castle, seat of the imperial government on this island for 700 years, and by, of course, Victoria's throne in that great throne room with its royal portraits and all the rest of it. But that was the beginning of something. Strand 2 being progressed, certainly between the more moderate, you would say, at that stage, Ulster Unionists and the SDLP at that stage, and it was the beginning of talks that were important. And of course, this also relates to a meeting between, first of all, John Hume looms very large at this period, and John Hume's ideas, for example, very much capture the imagination of the British government in 1990 and 1991. For example, John Hume arranges, first of all, he meets a man called Eamon Burns, the deputy head of the NIO, near Derry, we're told, in March 1990. And Burns notes that Mr. Hume wanted to talk about the importance of recent statements by Martin McGuinness, the leading Republican. And he accepted that making progress between the Stormont parties was important, but he felt that these speeches by McGuinness, which were now beginning to raise, he was asking Brook what would happen in the event of an IRA ceasefire, that these were significant. Brook thought they were significant as well, and he actually wrote a letter to Thatcher outlining the progress, very little, in the all-party talks so far, but factoring in Martin McGuinness's comments and saying, I had to knock him back, but I think this is significant. And word comes back from Thatcher through her personal secretary saying, continue, you're on your present course. This is in kind of 1990, 1991, which is interesting as well. Hume's ideas had been explained to various audiences in private. He had long discussions and plays with people like Richard Needham, but he hadn't actually spoken to Peter Brook. So it was agreed that Brook would doorstep Hume at Hume's office in the House of Commons in May 1990 to discuss his ideas. A very, very interesting insight. First of all, there was that old kind of love-hate relationship between John Hume and Seamus Mallon. Seamus Mallon was suspicious when he heard Brook was coming. Brook agreed he would give him a cover story, that he'd come to see how Mr. Hume got on his recent American tour. And they have a private conversation in Hume's office at Westminster. And it's interesting, Brook asked Mr. Hume if he would explain his political strategy. And responding, Mr. Hume said he had really two strategies. The first was posited on reaching agreement with the Unionists. This would clearly have to involve early conversations between the Unionists and Dublin, and he'd agreed with Charles Haughey that Articles 2 and 3 would be on the table, and that change was possible there if a settlement was actually, a proper settlement was agreed. Ranging more widely, Mr. Hume said that the emphasis on territory in Unionist political attitudes and in the Irish Constitution was a debilitating obstacle to progress. He wanted to focus on a potential union of people, not of land, but for this to happen, the Unionists needed to define themselves in a positive way, rather than relying on the old negative stereotypes of no surrender, etc. The negative philosophy, which Unionists had become wedded to, was a travesty, he said, of an essentially creative people from whose stock had come 11 US presidents. So we have this amazing discussion, and Hume's ideas are beginning to crystallize. He's already talking about, reluctant at first to use the word power sharing, but some sort of partial in government at Stormont. A North-South Ministerial Council, we have it today, and the idea talked about a dual police force in Belgian lines, separating the anti-terrorist force with the civilian force at this period. And again, he predicts Paisley's flexibility at the end of the day. Every year, I didn't say it this year, when the NAO mandarins sit down and wonder if Paisley's ever going to make the move to shake the hand of nationalism, they always come up with the same answer, as did the late Maurice Hayes, who died a few weeks ago. They always come up with the answer, he will, when he's top dog. And so it came to pass, as you remember, shortly after that as well. And we've got a darkening landscape. I don't know if that's just looking at my watch, haven't much time left, but I suppose the other big issue of this period was pressure from the British government, through the NAO, from the ambassador in Dublin, Sir Nicholas Fenn, on the new papal nuncio to Ireland, a man called Emmanuel Gerada. Sam and I have got our tongues around this guy over the last couple of years. He was a Maltese prelate. The previous prelate, Brandy, the British and indeed the Irish government felt was very pro-Republican in his views, and suddenly a large multi-billion pound amount of money appeared in his bank account, and he was asked by the Irish government, well, he was from Sicily, I should say. But anyway, his replacement was much more pro-British in outlook. He was from Malta, former British possession, Gerada, and there was pressure on him right away from the ambassador in Dublin and from the NIO to intervene with the Pope to produce some sort of papal statement condemning the violence of the IRA, and going further, actually supporting the democratic institutions in Northern Ireland, as the NIO put it. Early soundings of the new prelate suggested he was open to this. He compared Cardinal O'Fee with Cardinal Daly. He said Cardinal Daly was a leader of man, Cardinal O'Fee wasn't. He was making all the right noises. And the officials got working in the NAO to consider the various options, what the Pope might say, if he was prepared to make a statement to be read in all Catholic churches at Mass on a particular Sunday in 1990. That's what they were looking for. What Ken Bloomfield told the continuum of the anti-violence speech by the Pope at Drogheda, Pope John Paul II, of course, at Drogheda in 1979 during his visit to Ireland. They looked at the idea of excommunication, the Catholic Church's position, but they felt that this could create problems because the Church's condemnation, if they excommunicated people who were involved in IRA activity, it might be seen as one-sided, in which Catholics saw as a dirty war with a questionable system of justice. So they backed away from that and came back to the papal statement. In the end, the prelate agreed that he was going back to Rome in May 1990 to celebrate Mass with the Pope, whom we seem to know well, and he would raise this issue. Now, of course, no such papal rescript against IRA violence or violence generally emerged during the 1990s. But what did emerge, as we discovered from last year's file, was on the sudden death of Cardinal O'Fee in April 1990, the elevation of Bishop Cathal Daly, an ecumenist, Bishop of Down and Conor, considered, I suppose, papabile, as they say, was actually elevated to the Archdiocese, the Archsee of Armagh. And I would say it was Cathal Daly who actually warned the Pope against any statement that might be seen to be too pro-British in tone. But certainly Gerada's role and British influence over Gerada, from Dublin to the Secretariat of the Holy See, I think had a large role in producing the appointment of Cathal Daly. So that's just a flavour of this year's files. Thank you very much. And I'll leave these here for anyone who's interested in that event.
Thank you everyone who has come along to hear what we have to say about this, and in a wider sense, I suppose, thank you to you for your interest in these files, because I mean, certainly from the point of view of a newspaper, we're a commercial organisation, and if no one was interested in this sort of stuff, we probably wouldn't be doing it. So in a broader sense, people do seem to have a great interest in this, certainly from how these things are read, in particular online, where it's able to disaggregate, I suppose, what people are actually reading. I should begin by saying that I think probably Eamon would agree with me in this, because we had talked about it when we were going through these files. They are much more disappointing this year than they were 6 months ago. That's just the nature of these things. There are fewer files this year, quite considerably fewer files, and those which we got are generally a bit less interesting. There are little snippets of things here and there that are very interesting, but as Eamon says, there's no great overarching picture. But don't worry, I'm going to keep talking for the next 25 minutes or so don't be heading for the door. Just a few words as well about someone who, over the, I suppose, 5 years I've been covering these files for, someone who just kept cropping up in them. Maurice Hayes, who Eamon wrote a very eloquent obituary for when he died at Christmas time, just before this particular tranche of files was released. He's someone who's long before my time as a journalist, somebody who I've had no interaction with whatsoever. But from going through these files, he's clearly a hugely significant figure, someone who emerges. He was obviously a very rare Catholic at the upper echelons of the civil service in that era, but someone who clearly had considerable respect within the civil service, and not just because of the insight which he gave the civil service into how nationalists were thinking at a point when really it would seem from these files there was a dearth of that. Very often what he would be sending to his colleagues or to the ministers would be really long analytical pieces, sort of quasi-academic pieces, which are looking at how does nationalism interact with the Irish language, why does it matter, why does West Belfast vote for Gerry Adams, that sort of thing. I'm sure in many of these cases his advice wasn't necessarily followed by ministers or followed by his colleagues, but you have to think that if somebody of that background wasn't at the top of the civil service, wasn't at least prompting those sorts of conversations, there would have been an even greater dearth, I suppose, of informed thinking as to how government policy was being developed. The other thing which struck me this year is that the files from Dublin, and as David has said, it's quite difficult, and probably it's our fault as journalists sometimes. We don't really make it just as explicit as we should as to where files come from. They're all released at around the same time, and some come from London, some from Dublin, some here from Belfast. But the files from Dublin this year, I think, are much more interesting than anything out of London or anything out of Belfast. There's the story of the letter which purports to be from the UVF, telling Charlie Haughey, the Taoiseach, that MI5 had asked the UVF to assassinate him, that they had refused. All sorts of other allegations in that letter. Also the allegation from a priest that Gerry Adams had allegedly set up the Loughgall IRA unit for assassination. I think one of the things that comes out of those two really striking and really newsworthy pieces of information is the importance of context in how we report this, and it's something that when you see how people react to some of this information, seems to be just totally lacking. I think that in both of those cases there are significant questions, and I'm not a historian. Eamon's much more adept at testing it from a historical point of view, but the letter from the UVF, lots of questions as to whether that was how the UVF did communicate. There's no code word, headed notepaper. People who have reported on the UVF in great detail say that wasn't something they were ever aware of. And likewise, the tale of Gerry Adams allegedly setting up the Loughgall gang. Question marks over who it came through, whether that was actually something which was credible, and something which very often creeps up in these files is the passing on of rumour. Government can be a great rumour mill. Diplomats are bringing in all sorts of tidbits of information. It may be hugely significant, and you can understand why they would not be dismissing anything, but without corroboration, I think we have to retain a healthy scepticism and see these in a wider context, which is not to say that we shouldn't report them, because one of the potentials of putting this out there in the public domain is that somebody does come forward and says, actually, I know a lot more about that did happen, or comes forward to say that's nonsense and I know who did that and it was a hoax or whatever. So there's maybe hidden significance in some of what can seem fairly mundane even at points. The other thing is that Eamon has been talking about some of the Brook talks. Some of the records which were released this year, really they are tortuously heavy. We spent days going through some of these files and really gleaned very little from them. It gives one an insight, I suppose, into how a talks process operates. We're in the context of two talks processes at the moment, or there was a talks process in Northern Ireland. It's really on hold at the moment, but Brexit is obviously on a massive scale a talks process, a political negotiation, and really what you see in these files is how parties fight over a sentence, a paragraph, a word, maybe for days on end, and that is not to say that they are wrong to fight over those things. Those are crucial if these agreements are actually going to be meaningful, if they're going to be able to be sold to the two communities who the parties represent. But from the point of view of the officials, it must be pretty interminable, going round in circles. And there was a glorious example of this in one of the files where it was from the early 1990s, and the minute which was taken by one of the officials said, it was a meeting with the various parties, the Secretary of State said to the Unionists that he understood their sensitivity about the use of the term proposals. On the other hand, the term suggestions seemed limited, and he wondered whether use of the word propositions might meet the requirement. Mr. Molyneux said it would not. Any move away from the term suggestions would mean that the boundary between a chairman and adjudicator would be crossed. The term suggestions would give any candidate sufficient scope to act. The Permanent Secretary then put forward a form of words which he thought might meet the Unionists' objections. He then went on to set that out. Dr. Paisley felt that this was a good piece of work, but said he still saw difficulties with it. So really at the end of this very long process, they have crept very slightly forward, but have still got considerable work to do. Several of the snippets from the files which I picked up on, I'll just romp through these very quickly here. One which I found quite amusing and also quite telling as to how the civil service can work. Really the idea of Sir Humphrey, I suppose, the caricature of a senior civil servant who's either steering his minister or speaking through his minister at various points. There was the case of Richard Needham, who was obviously very involved in Northern Ireland over a considerable period of time as a directorial minister. He wanted Northern Ireland's electoral poster law brought into line with the rest of the UK. He wanted it to be a bit more difficult for parties to simply erect campaign posters on every flagpole, on every lamppost. There's a certain slip there, and he was really quite adamant about this. It was something which he just kept coming back to. This was almost 30 years ago, and obviously today this is something which is still being raised. Mike Nesbitt recently had a proposal to ban the use of posters altogether, which didn't actually ever make it into law. But the officials did not want to go along with this. It's very, very clear. There were officials from the Department of the Environment, I think it was, from Road Service, from various wings of government. They were all corresponding with each other in this fairly lengthy file. And one of them referred at one point to Mr. Needham's continuing interest in this issue, which to me was really just dripping with, I suppose, the frustration that he just kept asking about it, but they did not want to go anywhere with it. Ultimately, it did not happen, and it may well. I'm not passing judgment as to whether they were right or he was right, but it just shows that the minister doesn't necessarily always steer what happens within his department. One of the other interesting things, just away from the high politics of this period, was about the M3, the bridge which probably lots of us passed over or under on our way here today. The land on which that was built in the 1990s was really heavily contaminated, and that was something which, from speaking to some people who have an interest in these matters, said they hadn't realised at the time. I can't say conclusively, and it's one of the frustrations from these files sometimes, that one isn't sure what's new and what was actually known at the time, but certainly from the internal confidential discussions within government, the officials knew that some of the land was really critically contaminated. One piece of land near Dalton Street in East Belfast, just where the M3 meets with the Sydenham bypass, had over 5,000 times the recommended concentration of mercury. I wondered from that phrase what the recommended concentration of mercury would be, given how toxic it is, but it was very heavily polluted, and there were other substances, sulfates, arsenic, etc., in the ground, which an expert consultancy said were so serious that they would actually corrode building materials. So things like concrete, steel would not be secure in the ground. They would actually be eaten away by this potentially over time, so they would have to be protected. So some of this was taken away. It was dumped as landfill, really, in what is now the Giants Park in North Belfast. That was the North Foreshore dump at that point. It was dumped as special waste there. But there was then a second difficulty with some of the boreholes which had been driven in very deep into the ground, which were to secure this huge structure. There was water accumulating in these. They were beneath the water table, which is quite high at that point. And this water was really critically polluted, and they had done samples of it. It was very heavily polluted with mercury in particular, and this was something which was going back and forward within government for quite some time. How would they deal with this? The road had to be built, they had to get on with it, but how would they actually deal with this? And what they ultimately agreed to do was effectively flush this into the sewage system, and it would ultimately end up in Belfast Lough via, it would seem, the River Lagan, or certainly the lower part of the River Lagan. The officials had calculated that there would be about 4.4 kilograms of mercury per day, and that the maximum legal limit would be about 5 kilograms. But that this would be okay because the dilution available within the loch would mean that this would fundamentally not breach their targets for pollution there. Now, that is hugely significant, not just in terms of how government operates and in terms of those decisions. And one of the things which actually comes out of that file is to see the tension between the environmental official who is pressing this at every juncture, really, and some of the road service officials who are pressing in the opposite direction. And ultimately it is they who at various points say it's not practical, really, to get a huge tank to store this water temporarily in case we find that suddenly it's even higher than the 4.4 kilograms. Really, we'll just monitor it every day, and if there's an issue, we're going to have to step in. That is now part of Belfast, which is being very heavily developed, apartment blocks, all sorts of things. One of the things which is mentioned in this file is actually the concern about any sort of gardening on the site, because that would draw up from the soil some of what may be buried beneath. So something which I find very interesting, far away from talks or anything of that nature in terms of the troubles. One of the other things, just in terms of the frustration of the file sometimes, is that sometimes a file ends, sometimes we don't know how it continues. We'll maybe get the next file next year, maybe we won't, maybe the file will be lost or it'll be destroyed or whatever. But there was a file about the Royal Anglian Regiment's command officer. It wasn't a file, it was really a document within a file, from an NIO security official who was liaising with the military in the northwest. And he said in this file to colleagues that the commanding officer of the regiment had in 1992 taken what he said was the risk of making his men patrol in berets rather than helmets in Londonderry in 1992. This was in an effort to improve military-civilian relations, and he really held it up as an example of something which he said no other commanding officer would do. This was very significant. It showed that he was prepared to, if not put himself at risk, certainly put his men at a degree of risk, which a helmet would provide some protection from. Now, one of the things after that was published was that several people who had been in the military got in touch with me and said, we're confused by this. We were in the military long before that. We wore berets. We don't think that this is that significant. We're confused as to why an official at that level, who was a specialist really dealing with the security side of the NIO, would have thought that this was so significant. Was it that this was just a friend of his and he was trying to put a good word in for him? I've no idea as to what actually happened there, but it's one of the examples, I suppose, of how the file tells us something, but it doesn't tell us the whole story, and I suppose we are to a certain extent piecing together pieces of a very large jigsaw. One of the other, just going back to the politics of this, one of the interesting things that struck me about Ian Paisley was that just 7 years after his really most famous speech, probably where he bellowed never, 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 never outside Belfast City Hall in terms of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, he was privately admitting to John Major that the unionist reaction to the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which had been so visceral, had been really counterproductive. There was a private meeting at Downing Street between Ian Paisley and Jim Molyneux and the Prime Minister, and he told the Prime Minister in the presence of the Ulster Unionist leader that there was no question of them walking away from what were then the tentative talks that were emerging. They had run away from participation in Westminster and local councils in the past, and that had been a mistake. Now, I think that is particularly interesting because several years before this, Peter Robinson had been involved in what had been the task force report, and that was something where really he was, I suppose, trying to say at that earlier stage, just a couple of years after the Anglo-Irish Agreement, that what unionism was doing was strategically a mistake, that they needed to engage. At some point they were going to have to come back to the table, they were going to have to try to negotiate the agreement away, or at least try to take off what they saw as the hard edges of it. And at that point, Ian Paisley really, and Jim Molyneux, who had one of his MPs as part of this group as well, really reacted very angrily to that. They saw it as an assault on their leadership to a certain extent. They denounced this, which is very unusual at that era, or in the particular era that we were in, because they were really trying to present this united front, that all of unionists were together in standing against what they saw as an assault on the sovereignty of the British government in Northern Ireland. So that I suppose could be seen as a belated acceptance that perhaps Peter Robinson in that sense was right, not just in terms of what we think today, but in terms of what Ian Paisley actually privately thought in 1992, so pretty soon after the event, and perhaps that explains some of the relationship between those two men as they went forward, where at that point they had fallen out over that issue, but fundamentally, ultimately, Peter Robinson remained a hugely significant strategist within the party. I'm just going to check as to how long I've been rambling on for. I'm going to bring this to a close. Two very quick things. Senior civil servants were very alarmed at the Northern Ireland Conservatives launching in Northern Ireland. This was a fledgling attempt by the Tory party to stand in Northern Ireland. The mainland parties had not stood here. There was the campaign for equal citizenship, I think, wasn't it called, which Robert McCartney and other people were involved in, which really tried to argue, I suppose, that if the big parties in Britain were to stand in Northern Ireland, that would it would give better democratic a better democratic chance to the people of Northern Ireland to influence their government, which set taxation, which decided whether to go to war, and all sorts of other issues which are not at any point devolved to Stormont, and also that it would potentially move us beyond the sterile arguments of sectarianism. If people were debating taxation, if they were debating social policy, that would maybe get us away from there. That hasn't worked out for various reasons, obviously, with that hindsight, but there was a degree of excitement in a part of Northern Ireland anyway around this idea and the potential for it at that point. Civil servants in the NIO were very concerned about this. They thought this would leave the Secretary of State as someone who could not present himself as an impartial figure, who could not chair talks in a way that would bring all of the parties on board. And they really warned him. Sir John Blellock, who was the permanent secretary and a very experienced official within the NIO, sent a pretty blunt assessment to the Secretary of State at that point. He warned Peter Brook that if he went down this route, that there would be a fundamental issue as to whether you and other NIO ministers wish to operate as party politicians in the province, and if you do that, you cannot by definition remain impartial as between the various parties in the province. The ministers, however, didn't quite agree, and they managed to annoy both the Northern Ireland Conservatives, who felt that they weren't getting enough support from them, and that they were being too timid, and their own officials, who thought that they really should have nothing to do with their party in Northern Ireland. So Dr. Brian Mawhinney, who was of course from Northern Ireland, who was a directorial minister, his private secretary replied quite sharply. He said, Dr. Mawhinney has said he's not a member of the Alliance Party, and consequently he will not have to it the same relationship he has to the local Tories. So there was this sort of degree that nobody was really happy out of that. Ultimately it wasn't really terribly important, I suppose, because the Northern Ireland Conservatives fundamentally never really broke through in Northern Ireland, and perhaps it's in a different way more relevant today in terms of the relationship which the DUP have with that party now. And then just finally, very briefly, Stormont finance officials calculated that in 1991 public expenditure in Northern Ireland was close to 43% higher than the average for the rest of the UK. And they wondered whether that could be justified. So they were publicly or privately, I suppose, arguing with the Treasury that this was for all sorts of historic reasons. Northern Ireland needed to have higher spending, it was for good reason, and actually maybe we should get a bit more, we should have investment here for jobs and this and that. And as Eamon has alluded to, they were wondering whether they should make specific bids for certain projects to the Treasury. But this confidential assessment, really blunt assessment of government spending, found that in several areas of expenditure, Northern Ireland was receiving between 3 and 4 times more public spending than in the UK as a whole. There were various debates as to why this was the case. Was it that as a small region, Northern Ireland just didn't have the economies of scale which Whitehall would have? It would always have to replicate things like departments, and it would always just be more inefficient as a result of that. But they also said that there was the potential for moral hazard, where the existence of public expenditure gives rise to a need to absorb it by encouraging undesirable changes in the behaviour of individuals or organisations. And they said that if this was the case, it would explain why need and public expenditure seem to rise in step with each other, and also call into question the general assumption that securing a larger share of available public expenditure in the UK for Northern Ireland is a desirable objective. Now, viewing that through the prism of the RHI scheme, I thought that was a very interesting observation. There's a public inquiry there. It's not for me to say what actually happened there, but one of the theories there is that certainly how one of the Stormont officials described this at one point was that they viewed it as free money because it was coming from London. So it was a case of the money's available, if we're not spending it, that's really a terrible shame. Fundamentally, we know that that all went terribly wrong, and looking back on it, those people have quite considerable regret about that. But I thought that that was a surprisingly candid internal debate as to whether that was something which was good. And at the end of that, as with many of these documents, they said, we can't give you any firm conclusions. We think more work needs to be done in this. I'm not sure if any work ever was done in that. I'm sure it was, and that's something which we will no doubt find at a future point. Thank you.